Good evening, everybody. My name's David Goodman. I'm the director of the China Studies Centre here at the University of Sydney. Before we start, may I acknowledge the original owners of the land on which the university is based and on which everybody who is in Australia who may be listening to and participating in this webinar are also based. We acknowledge the contribution of their elders past, present and emerging, and the fact that the land on which we are operating belongs to them. Today is the second of three webinars on class and the Communist Party of China. It's a very great pleasure to have Professor Roca from Sciences Po in Paris talking about the middle class in China. And he's going to be introduced and moderated by somebody else who I'm really a great pleasure to introduce, and that's Professor Cam Louis, who is also based in Sydney. Cam was formerly at the University of Queensland, at ANU, and also in Hong Kong, where he held senior academic positions. Over to you, Cam.
Thank you, David. Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending this webinar on the Chinese middle class. Those of you who were at the talk last week on the Chinese peasants given Professor Guo Yingjie will remember that the largest class in China has always been the peasantry, but that in recent years, their numbers are getting proportionally smaller as more and more move into the towns and cities, even though the move may not be permanent. Most do so with the dream of joining the middle class. Who are these middle classes and what are their dreams? This is a topic of huge significance. This week, we have another world authority, Professor Jean-Louis Roca, to enlighten us about this class. A specialist in the study of Chinese society, Jean-Louis is a professor of sciences at Paris, France, and researcher at the Center for International Studies. He has spent 10 years in China, and in particular, 6 years as a full professor at Tsinghua University. So his research is grounded on first-hand experience of being a member of the middle class in China. Professor Roca is the co-author of Politics in China, Moving Frontiers, published in 2002, and author of A Sociology of Modern China, published in 2015. For today's talk, it's highly significant that in 2017, he published The Making of the Chinese Middle Class. I'm sure that today he will enlighten us with his ideas on the Chinese middle class that will be comprehensive and penetrating. The topic of his talk is Between Dream and Nightmare and the Chinese Middle Class. As before, you can ask questions or make comments after the presentation, or input your questions and comments into the Q&A or chat panel underneath. Anyway, without further ado, I will ask Professor Roca to speak now. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I prepared that. As you know, I'm French and I'm not a native English speaker. You know, I prepared some slides to help me to, explain to you to a certain extent the way I'm dealing with the problem, the issue of the Chinese middle class. The middle class in China, and then I'm sharing my screen, and I hope you can quite. There is no problem about that. Sorry, my computer is a little bit slow. Okay, I hope it's okay. Everybody is able to see the screen without problem. Okay.
Yes, it's okay.
It's okay. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Yes, I changed a little bit the title to a certain extent to be more clear, you know, and to be even clearer. I will say I will start by saying that 50 years ago, you know, I started to deal with the emergence of the Chinese middle class, and I followed the development of many studies in China and outside China about the emergence of this middle class. And today, I'm mainly dealing with I'm mainly dealing with the crisis, the malaise and maybe the collapse of the Chinese middle class. That it is a very strange experience to analyze social class, and at the same time to deal with its crisis and maybe its collapse. And my idea is to explain how did we go from dream to nightmare about the issue of middle class in China. Then how to deal, first of all, how to deal with the Chinese middle class. When I began to study the Chinese middle class, I discovered very rapidly that for Chinese researchers, the Chinese middle class exists or should exist to a certain extent. I have no time here to elaborate on that point. But the most important point is that everyone has his own or her own definition, had and has still, his own definition. For some people, it is the income, which is the most important criterion to evaluate, to assess the fact you belong or not to the middle class. For other people, it's the consumption. For the people, the level of education, to be graduate or undergraduate being a mark of, belonging to that class. For the people, it is occupation, which is the most important element. For the people, lifestyle, and even political opinions, or the way they are thinking about the nation affairs to a certain extent, could be criteria for deciding if you are or not belonging to the middle class. And then, of course, as a consequence of this situation, there is a great discrepancy about the proportion of the middle class and the total population. And if we look at the literature dealing with the middle class, we have proportion starting from 4 or 5%. If we are dealing with public or political opinions, for example, or the fact to be involved in social movements, etc., or if you are just taking the level of income as the most important criterion, you could consider that there is now 60% of population in China which is belonging to the middle class. Then we have a paradox here that we know what is the Chinese middle class, roughly speaking, as we say, without being able to define this class very clearly. To a certain extent, it's like a shadow, very easy to see, but very difficult to catch and to give a clear definition. And finally, I conclude by saying that the only useful definition of the middle class in China, the basic, to a certain extent, definition, is to say that there are people between the poor and the rich. But to go beyond this point, I rely on a method used by a very famous sociologist in Europe, a student of and a friend to a certain extent to Pierre Bourdieu, called Boltanski. We tried exactly to do the same thing I tried to do, and I'm continuing to try, is to understand, the notion of middle class in China. For him, there is we had exactly the same situation in the 80s in Western Europe. How to interpret the rising number of people between the poor and the rich in terms of class. Because we are talking middle class, we are talking of class, of course. What is the method developed by Boltanski? Is that the starting point is that there is no middle class in itself. It is absolutely impossible to give a clear and consensual definition of the middle class. There is no substance, I would say. We could be called middle class, but there are discourses on the middle class which contribute to its emergence in the public debate. The discourse on the middle class for him is produced by imaginaries. That is a certain way to consider fact. Here, new social categories. But of course, for him, imaginary, imaginaire in French, is not fantasy. There is, of course, a series of objective facts on which imaginaries are relying on, but these facts are constructed a certain way by the media, by the scholars, by many people. And who are the producers of imaginary? They are coming from different circles of society, official discourse, the media, scholars, and everyone who considers himself or herself as middle class. Then the most important thing is that there is a performative effect in that matter, a process of identification that some people are calling about the existence and the definition of middle class. And this discourse triggered a long and complex process of identification, criticisms, debate, etc., etc. Of course, this method compares to compare China with other countries, because here we are using a method which has been constructed in a very different context. But comparing, for me and for Boltanski, doesn't mean that China should follow a model. That means to find out the commonalities and the differences between two situations. Here, how two very different societies have dealt with the construction of the notion of middle class, and to find out commonality, and more importantly, probably differences can allow to better understand China. That also allows to avoid explaining everything about a culture or a tradition which is specific, absolutely specific to China. Of course, China has specificity, but the most important thing is precisely to take into account this specificity in comparing China with other countries. What to compare? Two things. For example, first of all, raw facts, say to a certain extent, facts that could not be denied and that they exist by themselves. In China now, we have a social category emerging, which have more money, who are traveling, who are buying fats, who have a complete different lifestyles than the previous social categories before the 90s. But we have also to compare imaginary and representations with imaginaries and representation in China, without, once again, strictly opposing raw facts and imaginary. I do separate the two for heuristic reasons, for pedagogic reasons, if we want to use this term, but of course, we cannot separate the two. About the sources, I have no time here to elaborate, but I could, of course, provide people who are interested on that matter with bibliography, academic books, articles, papers, including student studies, newspapers, media report, and interviews, which is, I think, very important because precisely there is a performative element in that way of dealing with the Chinese middle class. In terms of raw facts, what we have in China, we have a complete reshaping of the Chinese society with many common points with what we call in Europe the glorious 30s, due to rapid economic growth and the new society emerging at that time in Western Europe and now in China. Some elements, some phenomena, we say, that we have in common in the two situations, once again due to rapid economic growth. Massification of education, urbanization, diversification of employment with the development of very active service sector, dramatic increase in living standards for a vast majority of the population, development of big companies, the change, and more importantly, maybe change in lifestyles and in representations of, we can call, the good life to a certain extent. The consumer society is at the core of the society in Europe at that time, and now in China. The emergence of holidays, of new goods, new social categories, sexual revelations, new behaviors, new pretensions in terms of, for example, education for your child, etc., etc. Then a lot of common points from this point of view. And in general terms, the emergence of new social categories which have only in common to be neither poor nor rich to a certain extent, which is once again the basic definition of a middle class, and which is making a very big difference compared to what happened, what was the situation in the socialist China, as we say, before the 90s, or in the traditional Western European country before the Second World War. The specificity of the Chinese case in terms of raw facts, only 20 years, we have to remind that the emergence of the middle class is a very new phenomenon which started at the end of the 90s, over 30 years in the Western Europe. Very important, I think, that China is not a democratic country. If we are, of course, starting from the relying on the usual definition of democracy or democratic institutions in political science. Western European countries were already democratic states at that time. And then, people were saying that, the middle class or the new middle class, played a very important role in the democratization of European countries, I think are completely wrong, because the transition was made in the 50s, where precisely we had this emergence of the middle class in Europe. Another difference is that before the 90s, China already had a welfare state with good salary, housing, welfare system, etc. And the system collapsed, That exactly the opposite situation in China, that in Europe, the welfare state was established at the time, at the same time as the middle class emerged. In Western Europe, in the 60s, we had less and less workers, that really a declined number of people working in industry. In China, the old working class, the socialist working class, established in the 50s, collapsed, but a new one emerged, composed mainly of migrant workers, and that's the big difference. In Western Europe, the new middle class replaced the petite bourgeoisie. In China, the two rose at the same time. I have no time, of course, for explaining all that and giving details about that, but you can get a lot of literature about that. The new in Western Europe as well, the new middle class composed of poor people climbing the social ladder, starting from the bottom of the society and entering the ranks of the middle class. In China, the middle class is mainly composed of people who were already in the middle of the society to a certain extent. And I'm dealing with the very important element, that the fact that most middle class members in China now are urban dwellers, are urbanites, that is very, very different situation. And urbanites who in the past, before the 90s, were in the middle of the society to a certain extent. Here, I'm talking about, the small bureaucracy. I'm talking about the class of employers and workers of state-owned enterprises, etc., etc. That is precisely this kind of people who became the new middle class. Here also, I have no time to develop, but the specificity of China is that even the definition, the vocabulary used to define the middle class is very complex, because you have here a lot of example of the way the middle class is named in China, and you see that this vocabulary is very sensitive. It's very mingan, because we have here, for example, the term 中产, which is, very, in terms of Marxist vocabulary, is just very, very clear. We have the term 阶级, meaning, class, etc., etc. I have no time, but and it is interesting, for example, to remark that for the official discourse, the usual way of naming middle class is the middle incomers, a sort of neutral way, and a way to avoid to speak about class, capital, property, etc., etc. And you see here the specificity of the recent history of China, of course. Why does a society invent the notion of middle class, as we say? I don't say that, a society can invent the phenomenon, which is the fact that we have people emerging between the poor and the rich, or the dominated and the dominant. But the notion itself of middle class, to solve, in fact, what is perceived as a problem in the process of modernization. For example, in the French case, but we can say that in most European countries, Western European countries, you have exactly the same phenomenon. The core question was, what is the future of capitalism? The future of capitalism, of the process of modernization, the two being highly identified, in that a modern society needs a middle class. For two very different reasons, and people precisely were very hot debate about that. For some people, the middle class is both the consequence and the driver of the modernization. We need that for capitalism, for the development of capitalism. But for other people, the French middle class could be a grave digger of capitalism, because remember that the left was very important in Western Europe, and many people in the 60s, 70s, and even in the 80s had as an objective to overthrow capitalism, to create a new, better society, a socialist-like, society, when precisely another step in the development of human beings to a certain extent. In China is quite different, of course, because precisely we have the Chinese specificities. In China, there is a consensus about the necessity to get going with the modernization process, including the notion of prosperity, for example, small prosperity, which is also another way to name the middle class. When we're talking about small prosperity, 小康, we are talking, in fact, about the middle class and the development of the middle class. There is also a consensus about the absolute necessity to create a middle class able to take in charge the modernization process. And the debate is more about what kind of middle class we have in China, and about the duties of the middle class in China. And from this point of view, three tasks were defined for the Chinese middle class: to drive the Chinese economy, to modernize, and to a certain degree to upgrade the Chinese people, to modernize the society, and to solve a political paradox I will try to define. First of all, they're a driver of the Chinese economy. Like, probably you know, that like in other modern capitalist societies, we need of consumer more than producers, and the most important driver of the economic growth being precisely the growing number of people belonging to the middle class. More precisely, we need of mass consumers who can buy sophisticated goods with high added value. That is precisely the middle class. Of course, the rich spend a lot of money, but they are few by definition. The poor, of course, consume. That's the case also in China, but they are consuming, low added value goods which are not really important from an economic point of view. For doing so, we need, first of all, to guarantee a high level of consumption to middle consumers. That's the reason why that in the past, but still now, we have a lot of articles in newspapers or in academic journals, and we have a lot of discussion, a lot of debate on internet, on social networks about the fact that to develop China, to keep going with economic growth, to keep going with modernization of the society, we need to reduce the price of real estate goods. We have to improve social protection, to guarantee good jobs to university graduates, precisely to protect the living standards of middle class, and to help them to be precisely the driver of the economic growth in China. Second element is that to allow migrant workers to enter the ranks of the middle class, and it is the meaning of the anti-poverty policies, which developed a lot recently, and the discourse about the fact that we have to expand the scope of the middle class in China to have precisely more people able to consume and to enter the consumer society. Second very important task for the Chinese middle class is to modernize, to upgrade to a certain extent the Chinese people. Here we have to remind that in China, middle class people are mainly urbanized. Why? Because urban dwellers were able to take full advantage of economic growth and became high-ranking consumers because they were already in a strategic position in terms precisely of taking advantage of the new policies. Homeowners, university students, skilled people, educated people are urban people in general. And more importantly, there is a development in the Chinese society of the idea that they are supposed to be at the same time potential good citizens, and there is an identification between middle class and citizens. We will go back to that idea later on. And in China, there is something very strong as well, that the idea that the quality of Chinese people is too low. And when we are talking like that in China, we are talking about the fact that still now, the vast majority of the Chinese population is composed of peasants, migrant workers, being peasants, I will say, even if they are, living in most of them are living in cities. And there is a clear discrimination against precisely the migrant workers of peasants' lifestyles, way of behaving, etc. And that we know that they do not queue, they bow, they spit on the floor, they do not respect to sides, they do not have the right taste, they speak too loud, etc., etc. And that there is a necessity to upgrade the Chinese people, to increase the quality of people, to civilize the population. And precisely it is a taste to a certain extent of middle class to be at the same time the driver of this process, and at the same time to be the recipient of the new people precisely able to civilize themselves, to change their behaviors and to behave like middle class people. Here, there is a very interesting point, is the comparison we can do between Europe and China. In Europe, the good tastes were defined by the old bourgeoisie aristocracy, but we have no this class in China, as you know. All the rich people are new rich, and in China, the elite are perceived as parvenu, which is true to a certain extent, and that is the middle class who are defining good taste, for example, where we are dealing with, the good manners, where to travel, where to go to eat, what kind of food we have to eat, etc., the clothes, the fashion, etc., etc. The middle class is playing a very important role. And of course, there is here a political aspect. The Chinese dream, small prosperity, etc., supposes to unify and stabilize the society, to create a new good life, which every Chinese is supposed to have access in the new future. And finally, the task of the Chinese middle class is to solve the political paradox. The political paradox is that there is a consensus about the necessity to democratize the society. Even the official discourse is full of reflections and references to the necessary democratization of the society. And for many people in China, that would be very important to have a free press, to have the ability to organize trade unions, independent trade unions, or association, etc., But at the same time, there is a consensus on the fact that, we can see that very few people are advocating really for election here and now. Even dissidents, for example, Liu Xiaobo, and we're reading Liu Xiaobo, is not talking about election, really. The power of the people for the people, etc., they are very cautious about that. Why? Because there is in China a certain number of cliché and common views about election-based system. For example, China is a big country, and that would be very difficult to organize elections. The fact that representative democracy is in crisis everywhere, including in Europe, or in France, in the middle of political campaigns, and we are talking a lot about the lack of democracy in the system of representative democracy, etc., That's not a true democracy to a certain extent. The fact that, as well, that authoritarian China is more efficient than many democratic countries for rising living standards and for taking decisions, and the pandemic is good example from this point of view. But the biggest problem, I think, is linked to the fact that China is viewed by the Chinese themselves as not having enough citizens, that is, middle class people. And precisely the mission, the duty of the middle class is to put pressure, I would say, on the party and the political regime to democratize, but not really to introduce election-based system, because precisely we have too many peasants supposed to be not educated, not able to think about the interests of the nation, easy to manipulate and to be bribed, etc., Then, roughly speaking, we can say that when China will have a large number of aware and conscious and responsible citizens, the time will come when representative democracy can be set. But for the time being, we have too few people of that kind, I will say, of good quality, really to introduce election-based system. And many people think like that, including the peasants, the migrant workers, when they are discussing, when I did extensive interviews of migrant workers, many migrant workers are saying that we are not a good quality, we have to change, we have to, etc., A new society of middle class people emerged. And I would like to go back on that idea that the imaginaries that reign over Chinese society today give pride of place to the middle class. Middle class discourse is everywhere in China. Everyone dreams of being part of the middle class and adopting its lifestyle. Everyone, including, once again, the poor, migrant workers' objective being precisely a member of the Chinese middle class. Even the field of social conflicts was permeated, I think was because, the pandemic changed a lot of things from this point of view by the issue of the middle class, with some expecting political reforms. Remind that, during 10 years ago, there were a lot of movement among homeowners against social movement against, management companies, developers, etc. And for many people, including Chinese scholars, it was probably a very important element from a political point of view, because homeowners were being in position to put pressure on the Chinese government to adopt some political policies. We see that it's more complex than that, but the idea was here, even to a political role of the Chinese middle class. More importantly, and here I'm shifting gradually shifting to the notion of nightmare. I talk a lot about the dream. Now we have to go to shift to the nightmare. New norms and values have emerged completely at odds with socialist ethics. Working hard, entering constant competition with others from an early age. We know that now, for some parents, the process of competition starts very, very early. At 1 year old or 2 year old, they are still starting to think about the best school, etc., and using all possible means to succeed and to accumulate money, prestige, and status. Is something which we can be compared with the, I would say, the rat race. The continual competition between people to get the best positions in the society. These new norms and values are very demanding of time, energy, etc., etc. A new expression have, ironically, epistomized this new trend on social networks. For example, the 996, meaning working from 9 to 9, 6 days a week. The 07, meaning for 24-hour working day, 7 days a week, etc., etc. Then the dream of becoming rich and climbing the social ladder and to fight with the other one, continuously, is at the core, I would say, to a certain extent, of the Chinese dream. And precisely this kind of dream is a source of anxiety for many Chinese middle-class people. For example, as you know, the access to homeowning and in the right place because, we have place to buy an apartment in terms of prestige. You have to live here and not here. In terms, of course, of getting a place where we have a very good school beside to put your child, etc., etc. That's a very important aspect of the emergence of a consumer society in China. But it is not the only one. I think that consuming became a source of pleasure, but also a source of anxiety, which is not very different from what we had in Western Europe. Urban people must spend a lot of money of decorating their house, buying cars, traveling, practicing sports in gyms, preparing their child for a school or competition at any price, and then mobilizing, accumulating a lot of money from that. Many articles, academic articles, take the theme of slavery when describing the situation. Members of the middle class became slaves, have become slaves to real estate, their child education, their car, etc., and etc. But anxiety comes also from the fact that they fear all the time not to do the right choice in matters of house, clothes, school, and so on. Here we have a very specific characteristic of the Chinese, of the middle class in general, the fact that, middle class people are people who have the choice, but they have to choose. The rich have no problem with choosing because they can buy what they want to buy. The poor have no choice; they have to eat first, etc. The middle class has a specific problem: how to spend my money respecting the norms, the values, the manners, etc., etc. In the face of these demands, the middle class resources are running out, and the turning point is the beginning of the 2010s. Competition in the job market and the education market has become tougher due to slow economic growth. Jobs are becoming scarce and less paid, including in low value added sectors, in which internal migrant workers are employed, no chance to enter the ranks of the middle class for them. Even graduates from the most prestigious Chinese university like Tsinghua or Beijing University cannot get a teaching position in the key high school in Beijing as well. Then this problem not only to enter the ranks of the middle class, but to stay here, to remain, in the ranks of the middle class, becoming a problem for many people in China. And there is no time to develop a problem of reproduction of the middle class now, because the new generation of middle class people with parents who are middle class are meeting now lot of problems to reproduce, to have the same, I would say, living standards and the same social status are their parents. For example, the fact that the price of apartments prevent the new generation from accessing of old home ownership, particularly in big metropolises, is a very important problem. And the rising housing prices accounted for a large part of the Gini coefficient now, which is measuring the difference between the poor and the rich in China. And in relation with that, we have recently new cultural movements, like we can say, that express at the same time this kind of malaise within the middle class about the capacity and the interest, to a certain extent as well, to be the middle class. Not only they have problems to enter or to protect their position, their status as a middle class, but finally many people in the new generation said, okay, why to continue like that? What is the interest to be in the rat race and to play the game to a certain extent? They have all the desire to break away from the new norms and values, in particular the cults of success and conception. Here, a list of a cultural movement we can see in mainly in the social networks. Social networks play a very important point from this point of view. I have no time to develop, but probably a lot of people know a lot about this new movement. But probably the most interesting, and I will finish with that, the most interesting movement is a Tangping movement, which appeared recently. It was a relatively, the movement, emerged some years ago, but developed really very, very recently. And Tangping, that means that stopping living a life that confirms to new norms and value. The word is mainly used to describe life wars of effort and struggle when an individual or group is under too much pressure in life and decides to quit. Most of these people are young people, and the objective now is just to meet their most basic needs. They do not want to work a lot, they don't want to marry, they don't want to compete, they don't want to have babies, they do not want to consume. And that will be my conclusion, a very, very rough conclusion, that even it's too soon now to say that the middle class is really, the middle class dream will be a failure. And we have to notice that barely 20 years after the start of the dream, the model is in crisis, not because of the pandemic, because we had already elements of this crisis before the pandemic, But first, because like in Western Europe, China is not able to protect and to expand the middle class. And that's something we can find out from the experience of Western Europe. Second, because the young generation, the game of social competition is no longer worth the candle to a certain extent. That recalls what happened in the 60s and 70s in Europe, when some movements came to challenge the moral foundation of capitalist society based on work, effort, competition, etc., etc. Of course, there is a big difference. In China, it's not a political attitude. It was a political attitude at the same time in Europe. No design that in this cultural movement to overthrow the regime or even to speak about politics, just an individual decision, but collective to a certain extent. That's a social phenomenon to break with the rat race. That fits very well into the logic of depoliticization that dominates the Chinese society. And I wrote a lot about precisely social movement in China, which epitomizes this phenomenon. Nevertheless, the malaise, I think, of the Chinese middle class cannot but have political implication. The question being how to deal with a society which does not want to play the game. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. No, that's a fantastic and interesting lecture. I've really gotten a lot from it, and I particularly like you're going back comparing Europe so often, because clearly the idea of middle class, the bourgeoisie, as you pointed out, originated in Europe, and the whole political system, the current system anyway, a lot of it came from Europe. So the comparisons are really very, very apt and really enlightening thoughts. And I like the way you finish with the Tangping people too, because a lot of it in China they call them the people that don't want to cooperate. But in the West we also had that, as you point out, in the 50s, 60s, or in the 60s in particular, the big needs, the people who just find cults, withdraw from society altogether and sort of say, I don't want to do anything. Now, where that's interesting is that in the creation of the middle class, whatever that means in the Western world, took a long time. In China, things move so fast that the dilemma, the problems they have, the controversies in society and so on, it's basically in the last 20 years. 20, 30 years, the middle class is created, and now they've gone into a Tangping situation as well. So it's clearly that what that means, as you point out, is that a lot of dilemmas that needs to be solved immediately, and yet they can't be, because there's such big issues, and I like some of the logic and some of the reasons that you give, or some of the ways out of the situation. What I want to ask, one question. I'm sure other people would have questions that they want to ask, or they can put it up in the Q&A. So I don't want to take up too much time, but just a small question. That dilemma can't be solved, as you point out, with the solutions that the Chinese themselves propose and that you propose. And the reason why it can't be satisfactorily resolved is that you point out that the middle class is a very slippery concept, and in China it's probably between the poor and the rich, and probably between sort of 60% to 80% or something like that of the population, a huge population, and it's getting bigger. Now, whatever the middle class stands for, the Chinese Communist Party was established and still says they are for the lower classes. And if you have a situation where you're saying, okay, my job is to fight on behalf of the lower classes, the peasants, proletariat, whatever that means, and the peasants, proletariat are now getting smaller and smaller, and the middle class is getting bigger and bigger. So their whole idea is to fight against the middle classes. Now, whatever they say, whatever policies they put forward, it's going to be against the fundamental reason for existence for the Chinese Communist Party. So what I was thinking was, have you come across writings or arguments by other scholars or the Communist Party itself that somehow they have to change their philosophy, change the way that they talk about what being a good communist is? And if so, how do they rationalize it? Because I think that's quite important, because when I was in China, whatever class you belong to, we know the middle class is actually being a member of the Communist Party. Now and you had to be one of the lower classes to be a member, but now it seems like you have to be one of the middle classes to belong. So if in class terms, if they fight for their own benefits, the middle classes will have to be represented somehow. So what's your take on that?
I think the notion of small prosperity is very important, Xiaokang, because, I think it's very important. It is from the point of view of the Communist Party, and I met some, people who are dealing with that precisely in the party schools, etc. For them, it's another way to build up communism. Communism, what is communism? It is a state of a society where everybody is in the small prosperity, as we say, to a certain extent. They have enough money not only to survive, but to enjoy life without being rich, without having means of productions. We have exploiting other people. And to a certain extent, for me, the Chinese dream, is communism, a very different kind of communism Karl Marx was expecting, probably, but a sort of communism. If the Chinese Communist Party is able to make every migrant worker a member of the middle class, everything is okay. That's the deal. Is able to because the big difference between Europe and China, in that Europe, the new middle class was composed of people coming from the bottom of the society, workers without stable work, etc., no access to ownership, etc., etc. In China, it's a little bit different, because for the time being, the poor were left aside of that movement for the moment. The objective was to make a lot of migrant workers gradually into the ranks of the middle class. But for the moment, it's not the case for most of them. It's not the case. Precisely, the idea of the small prosperity and of a society without class, to a certain extent, which was also the dream of the European society as well in the 50s and the 60s. People say, okay, a society without class, because class struggle is very bad, etc., etc. Then we have to get rid of that and to create a society without class, and a very quiet society, because no competition, but no struggle, no fight, no contradiction, etc., etc. And to a certain extent, the Chinese dream, for me, the small prosperity, is a way to reach communism to a certain extent. That's very strange, but yeah, it's like that.
Thank you. Yeah, it is strange, because to me, the whole idea of Xiaokang is kind of suspect. But anyway, thank you.
Of course, no, but I say I don't support the idea. I don't support the idea. I just try to explain the way these people are thinking about, to keep a link between communism and China today, the Chinese social stratification, what is the trick, to a certain extent.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. There are a couple of questions, or actually several now, on the Q&A, and